Hello everyone, my name is Fox. This is going to be my review on Anbernic's latest device, their Win600. Thank you very much to Anbernic for sending this out to me for review. What's exciting about this is Anbernic's first x86 based device. I hope there's going to be more to come. There's a few things that we got to touch base on here just to kind of set your expectations on what you can do with this. The BIOS is fully open, so we can kind of explore that, and I'll give you a bit of tips and tricks on that, and I'll have a separate video on that as well. Don't just go ahead and overclock the RAM without having any clear idea of what's going on there. We're going to have a full review based on every watt of TDP on a benchmark. We'll take a look at that. This is the white model, and you can see that it has these green highlights. They're kind of a contrasting color that I kind of like a little bit. It was a little bit off-putting, I think, at first for me, but I've grown to actually like the contrast of color. This version of the Win600 I have Windows 10 on. I do really recommend Win 10. Ultimately, Windows 11 will run on this. However, Windows 11 has a different virtual keyboard, and I'm not a big fan of that. On this particular space gray model, they have this nice blue contrast here. So if you might like this a little bit better, and then they have the full color of the buttons here, which I kind of prefer. Overall, I'm a bigger fan of the space gray version as opposed to the white version. On this, I do have SteamOS running, and on this, I have Win 10 running. So we're going to be kind of comparing and contrasting both of them. But first, let's go ahead and talk about the build quality. So one of the things that we have to talk about here is these analog sticks. Now, if you notice, the device itself is kind of not straight. It's at an angle, and it angles outward. Now this is fine because it feels nice when it's in the palm of your hands. However, because it's D-pad dominant and these facepad dominant, it's most comfortable to use it like this. You'll be able to hit the triggers and do everything you need. However, if you need to use the analog stick, because the analog stick, if we just line it up, like if here's the D-pad right there, and you make a straight line going down, you can see that the analog stick is just offset a little bit to the left, which is pretty unfortunate because we're already going out like this. And then when we want to use the analog stick to have full motion of these triggers, our thumb is in a pretty bad spot. It would have been a little bit better if they angled it inward, but obviously we'd be chewing into this display a little bit. This is just a kind of a thing for me, is that I feel like it would have just been better if it was just offset a little bit better. All right, I figured right now is the perfect time to actually talk about the analog sticks and their sensitivity. So if we take a look, I'm just going to go ahead and push up. All right, and right there we've reached the end of where the sensitivity of the analog stick matters. However, I still have a good amount more travel. Basically exceeds its range. It's overly sensitive. Now, it has full range everywhere, which is great. On both these sticks, full range is there, except it's really exaggerated with how sensitive it is. What the problem with that is that when you're moving, you only need to move a little bit to go the full range, which means that when you're using this right analog stick for like camera movement, it's way too sensitive. Basically, you're like, it's almost digital in that respect. Like, you can kind of try to feather it a little bit, but you have to be so very precise with it that getting that analog movement is a little bit difficult. So that's the only other thing that I would say is an overall negative about these analog sticks, is that they are just overly sensitive. Let's quickly go over what's included in here. Obviously, we have the heatsink along with the exhaust port here. This is actually capable of exhausting all the heat needed for running this chip at its maximum. Now, this is a 3050E model that I have here, which typically maxes out at 18 watt. It can get a little bit better going up to like 20 watt, but it's really not worth it. I really classify this as an 18 watt part. At 18 watt, this is able to cool it off effectively. This is a USB 3 USB port, USB A, then we have 3.1 with PD3 compliant charging. Going on the right side, we have the business end of a lot of functionality that I'm glad that Anbernic added. Now, this is a keyboard key. This is like what Neo has. And then this is a mouse switch, much like GPD has included for everything. So if we're in mouse mode here like it is, this right analog becomes a mouse. And then you have right click and left click. This is the D-pad cursor keys on a keyboard. So this will be up, down, and then this is the scroll wheel. I wish this would have been a little bit better, maybe like WASD, WASD, instead of being a scroll wheel, because the D-pad still can scroll just fine. You don't really need additional scrolling. This is just like 2x scrolling, which isn't super needed. And then you have enter and escape, and then these buttons do nothing, as well as L2 and R2. So I wish that in mouse mode, Anbernic included additional functionality for X and Y and L2, R2, but that is pretty much it. And then if we take a look at gamepad mode, which is right here, this becomes basically an Xbox 360 controller, at which point everything is pretty much understood. And then we take a look here, if we can get a good shot of that. That is the keyboard key, and when you press this, it brings up the on-screen keyboard. Now, I will have a tips and tricks on how to get the better keyboard for Windows. However, this does not work in SteamOS. This will bring up the left side panel, the Steam button, not the Quick Access Manager. Then on the bottom, we have our stereo speakers, as well as a 3.5mm audio jack and our mic. And then on the left side, we have our power button, as well as the volume rocker. On the front, it is a 720 by 1280 portrait-based panel. So on Windows, if you wanted to play older games, you would need to wrap that API. Otherwise, SteamOS is going to have an easier time for you to play older games because that'll wrap it automatically. And we'll kind of touch base on that in a moment. The only other thing that I want to touch base on with regard to the panel is that it does appear to be PWM, so if you lower the brightness, it will strobe. So for people that are affected by that, you basically would just have to run this at full brightness to avoid PWM. It is not DC backlighting as far as I can see. We're going to touch base on the benchmarks in a moment. The only other thing I want to do is kind of take a look at the insides of this. So we're going to go ahead and cut to that, and then we're going to cut to the BIOS section of this. All right, so here is the business end of the Win600. One thing that I do like is that they actually color-coded the battery indicator. Now it also tapes it in so that, you know, you'd have to break the seal to kind of remove this. And this is what you kind of need to do to reset the BIOS anyway, so we'll touch more on that. Here we can see the battery. It is 2S1P, 8.7 volt, 4500 milliamp hour for a total of 39 watt hours. That's really the more important number that we care about. If we take a look at the main board itself, we can take a look at the Wi-Fi chip here. Let's go ahead and just... So we can see it is an Intel 3165D2W. Now what is nice that I like that Anbernic has done is if we take a look at the two antenna leads, they have one at the top and one at the bottom. So there's a nice separation between the two antennas, and they go over and then they connect so that the pigtails kind of connect right there. Pretty nice. I do like the separation of these antennas, so that's good. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting here, so this is the 3050E APU, AMD's 3050E APU, and if we take a look at the heatsink, what's interesting is it looks like it's just like stock thermal interface material, stock TIM. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this, even though it isn't necessary at all. I've really got good temps, even pushing it up to 20 watt, so that's pretty good. The other thing that's really nice here is that there is this tape that they got that kind of shrouds the fan itself, so that the blower of the fan is all concentrated going over these fins, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this, even though it's not really necessary. The biggest complaint I have is where the LCD connector is. So if you take a look here, the display kind of flops over like that, and it kind of sucks getting to it. So you have to kind of get the main board in here, and then these buttons kind of fall out, which suck. But that's more of just a complaint of assembly and disassembly. Not that that's a thing that you should be doing, but this is where I am, and I just wanted to kind of show you what the business end of the Win600 looks like. Here we have the single SODIMM slot that gets put in here. Here we have the 2242, and there it is, all cleaned up. Cleaned up actually super easy. Stock thermal interface just kind of just wiped right off. So I just use some isopropyl alcohol. I have some 97% stuff. Helps it evaporate easier. But that's it. So now I'm going to be able to reconnect this. All I have to do is just get it in place first and then connect this LCD cable, which is a bit of a pain. In case anyone was curious how much thermal paste I added, I add about a small pea on there. When you press it down, it'll kind of just flatten out. That's my usual approach, and it works pretty good for me. Alright, the only other thing worth pointing out here is that these 4 screws that hold it in seem to be the only screws in the entire assembly that are a bit different, so just make sure that you keep track of those if you're going to be swapping out the thermal interface material on this board. Right now, since I have it up, I'm not going to connect the fan or anything. I am going to connect the battery and just make sure that the display is working and all the other buttons are working. Once it's done, then I will go ahead and power it off and redo everything. Alrighty, so it went ahead and booted up. Everything is right there and connected. I'm going to go ahead and power it down. You really don't want to be running like this without a fan for too long, but it is a low power chip, so I'm not too concerned at the moment. But I just want to make sure that that's working. The battery just plopped out. That's it. So I'll go ahead and reassemble everything. All right, so I've gone ahead and connected a USB keyboard to this. So I'm going to go ahead and power it up and just hammer on the Del key. So as soon as you see that, you can hammer on the Del key. Now again, it is a portrait-based display, so when this comes up, it's going to look like this. So now when we go through here, there's something I want to show you. You can see that I have 8 gigs of RAM on here, and if we look here, it says current speed is at 3200 megahertz. I do want to caution against just pushing 3200 megahertz. I'm not really concerned about the RAM breaking or the machine breaking. If you need to reset the BIOS on this, what you'd have to do is just open this up, pull out the battery, give it about 5 minutes, and then plug the battery back in, and that should reset your BIOS. So you can see here that the RAM is defined as 2667 megahertz. On both of them, I have Lenovo and then also a Glowy brand, and both of them overclock to 3200 megahertz fine. However, the only thing that you need to be aware of is that when you do that, not this one, we want to go here, okay, and then you go to DRAM timing, and then you go ahead and click I accept. So in here, this will be auto. So what you'd want to do is click to enabled. Now I've set this to 1800 megahertz, and that's 3600 megahertz. Remember, this is DDR, double data rate. So 1800 megahertz times 2 is 3600 megahertz. Now, the thing is that all of these other parts here, these are the timings of the RAM. Now, we can, one of the reasons why I say don't really worry about it is because when you set this to 3600 megahertz, all of these timings go slower. Now, that's not super ideal in a lot of cases, basically because this machine is only single channel. By us increasing the memory clock, what we're doing is we're increasing the bandwidth that would go to the GPU. Ultimately, what I'd recommend here is that you should pick whatever frequency is what is rated for your RAM, and then at that point try to get better timings. And I'll have a separate video going over that as well. If we do that, we would ensure that we have the best speed for the CPU and the most bandwidth that we possibly can get to the GPU. But again, because the GPU is kind of lacking, we're really not going to be running a bunch of 3D based games. This is kind of a part where you really have to tune how well you want to run this machine and what type of content you want to run. Just doing 2400 megahertz with better timings actually works out better at lower TDP, versus raising this memory clock to 1800 megahertz is better at higher TDP. So you really have to kind of think about where you're going to run this machine. Most indie games are going to be around 8 watt to 9 watt. So I would probably recommend lowering the frequency a little bit. So this would be 1333 megahertz is what would be for the stated RAM of the machine. And it doesn't matter, like if you go ahead and put what is it, 2000 megahertz, this would say that it's 4000 megahertz on the RAM. It actually won't do it. It stops, it caps itself at 3200. So if I just say save and exit and let this reboot, we go here, go to Northbridge, and we take a look at RAM. Even though I set 4000 megahertz, you can see that we still cap out at 3200 megahertz. So you can't accidentally push it too far and like lock yourself out. Again, we are getting worse timings here, so just be mindful of what you are trying to attempt to do. So like even here where we have voltage, I've set to negative 130 millivolt. This doesn't undervolt at all. None of these things actually take hold, which is unfortunate because I was hoping that we'd be able to at least get better power on the chip itself, but it's not the case. At this moment, before we start getting into any game demos or anything, I just want to kind of take a look at benchmarks real quick, just to give you an idea of where this device sits performance-wise. So we'll go ahead and get into that now. All right, now the benchmark that I want to show here, I had others done, and I kind of collapsed it all down into this one because this tells a far better picture and should help illustrate and educate everyone on the importance of understanding a CPU-bound workload versus a GPU-bound workload. So here's the deal. On the left-hand side, all of these tests were done on Windows 10 with the Heaven benchmark. The only difference is that every benchmark run was done at a different TDP. If we take a look on the left-hand side, you can see 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way down to 13. Now I've gone up to 20, but on this one particular image, we're only doing 6 through 13 because I want to illustrate the difference what RAM makes. Now, the blue bar indicates the Win600 running with 2400 megahertz memory, but with automatic timings. The red bar indicates 2666 megahertz memory with auto timings, and the yellow bar indicates 3200 megahertz memory with auto timings. Now, the important part that I want to stress here is when you look at these bar graphs, how could it be possible that the 2400 megahertz memory is almost 2 times faster than the 3200 megahertz memory at the same wattage? At 6 watt TDP, 2400 is obliterating 3200 megahertz memory. And the reason for that is timings. Because the RAM is only set for 2666 megahertz, that's what it's rated at, it only has good timings at that frequency. If we push it up to 3200 megahertz, if we overclock it to that, something has to give. We have to lower the timings, and the system will figure that out automatically, and it will do that automatically in a safe way. The end result is that on CPU-bound problems, we're actually going to have a far worse experience using 3200 megahertz memory. The only benefit that we're going to get from this, that can benefit from more bandwidth. However, at extremely low TDPs, we are not able to feed the GPU enough to the point that it doesn't even matter. We are, in effect, only starving the CPU, and the GPU doesn't even need that bandwidth. The end result is that we just have tremendously low benches. And that is the case throughout every bench. If you take a look at the blue bar, it is in the lead from 6 watt all the way to 30 watt. The 2666 megahertz benches were just behind a little bit on the 2400 throughout every run. However, again, the timings mattered more to the CPU than just raw frequency. However, if we take a look at the next slide, there are 3 points that I want to get across to you, and hopefully this illustrates and educates you on what we're trying to accomplish. So the first thing is that the 3050E, you can really start to see at around 16 watts, we start to have major diminishing returns, and the returns that we're getting with the power that we're putting in are start to becoming lopsided. The only way that we're going to be able to extract more here would be either if the system was capable of dual channel RAM, it is not, is only single channel RAM, or one of the other points that I wanted to make here is that if you purchased 3200 megahertz RAM with solid timings, that would be another avenue to increase performance better. Again, the only thing I'm doing here is just overclocking the stock RAM that came with my Win600, and in that scope, that's only really beneficial at high TDPs where we're able to feed the GPU. If you take a look at 20 watt, what's happening here is we're only getting around a 12% performance increase by pushing that heavy overclock. So when you take a look at this data, what you should really understand is if you are going to be running 3D games and you just want to have better performance from 3D games and you do not want to buy additional RAM for this platform, overclocking to 3200 megahertz is fine as long as you're going to be rendering 3D games. However, if you're going to be running at lower TDPs, indie games, older PC games, you're going to be far better off taking that stock RAM, that 2666 megahertz stock RAM, instead put it to 2400 megahertz and then step through the timings. If you notice here, all of this is done automatically by the system. However, 2400 megahertz timings are sufficiently better than 2666 megahertz, and that actually gives us the performance advantage at low TDPs because we're able to shuttle data from the memory to the CPU fast enough in a meaningful manner at lower TDPs. At that scope anyway, we're not feeding the GPU enough that bandwidth actually matters. In that scope, we want to feed the CPU as much as possible. Now again, even though I don't like where the placement of the analog sticks are in general, nor do I actually like the sensitivity of them, we can still play modern PC games with the D-pad. It actually feels really good. Alright, as we can see here, like a game from Hades, we are looking at 13.5 watt. I've seen this creep up to about 15 watt just to be able to satisfy 60 FPS the entire time. The only thing that's worth mentioning here is that one of the reasons why I mentioned this machine being a 12 watt machine, and it will cap out around 18 watt. When we look at it from that point of view, Like right now at 12 watt, we're using around 20 watt total system power, and with the 39 watt hour battery, that'll give us around 2 hours of battery life. Where if we go up to 18 watt TDP, which is really the ceiling of how far we're going to be able to push the 3050E version of the Anbernic Win600, you're going to be looking at around 90 minutes of battery life in that regard. You can see that we're basically at 5 watt to 6 watt on the package power. So we're taking around 9 to 10 watts total system power. Now, because the battery is close to 40 watt hour, we would have 4 hours of gameplay time playing an indie game, a native PC indie game. And that's really where this device finds its strengths, is that it plays indie games very well on PC. When we take a look at emulation, specifically either if it's on SteamOS or if it's on Windows, GameCube and PS2 emulation is not going to be ideal when we're taking a look at 60 FPS targets. It'll do GameCube and PS2 with games that internally render at 30 FPS, 30 Hertz. But anything more is going to be kind of asking too much out of this platform. All right, let's talk about Windows 10 versus SteamOS on the Win600. Now, in my personal opinion, when it comes to candy bar type of designs, when you have less input, Windows becomes a little bit more of a drag. Thankfully, there is this mouse mode, so actually navigating in Windows is a better time. However, there are some things that I really wish that were better. So you have this Windows key here. Now, this Windows key is literally just the super button, so this will do Windows. Now, the home button, this is actually interesting. When you press this, it's actually showing the Xbox button, but it's doing it via the keyboard. So this is Windows plus G. And those are pretty much your only main avenues. Outside of that, you have to open up the virtual keyboard. So one of the problems is that because this is basically Win plus G and this is just the Windows key, to actually Alt-Tab, you actually have to bring up the virtual keyboard. Once that comes up, you have to basically press Alt and then press Tab. And then you can cycle through the different tabs that you have. Instead of just having a dedicated Alt-Tab button, that would have been preferable to me. Likewise, an Alt F4 or Control Alt Delete button. Those are actually really necessary, especially in Windows, to be able to have an ejector seat to get out of whatever you're in. But if you wanted to actually have exclusive full screen mode, you will be stuck in that mode unless you had some type of input to eject yourself out of it. Typically, any candy bar style Windows-based device, they need more inputs. If you don't have a keyboard, a physical keyboard, you're going to need more inputs to have ejector seat buttons to be able to get out of it. The INEO does that in a lot of regards, and I wish that Anbernic kind of had more buttons here as well. Overall, getting everything working on Windows is easy, and you have a large amount of compatibility. The big benefit here is that you do have Gamepass support. So if I go into Xbox, so with Windows we do have Gamepass here. So that is one of probably the biggest reason that you would run Windows at all on this device, is to have Gamepass support. Overall, it works really well. The additional thing here is that because we have Rise and Adjust and everything is already there, so here you see I'm running Cypher's Bat, which itself leverages Rise and Adjust to make the changes. So in here you would just call up the virtual screen keyboard, and then you would choose an option. So we want to run at, let's say 17 watts, so we're going to do D. So we'll press D here. Now this is just Cypher's Bat, but there we go. Now I'm running at 17 watt, PL1, PL2, 17 watt, which means that the system will run up to 17 watt if the demand is there. So Rise and Adjust is a little bit easier to get going, because on SteamOS you would actually need to build it, which can be a problem because SteamOS itself doesn't have any build tools available to it. So you'd have to inject that in there and get that running with Pac-Man before you'd even be able to compile Rise and Adjust on this. So I would probably say that SteamOS by itself, it's going to default to 20 watt PL1 and PL2 is 12 watt. So the system, for all intents and purposes, you should anticipate it going to be running as a 12 watt machine, which is fine for what I would say that it is. Likewise, if we look at the SteamOS build for the Anbernic Win600, there are a few things that carry over from these buttons that would have been beneficial if we had more buttons here, specifically to call out the QAM, or the quick access menu. Right now, either one of these buttons, so if you press the Windows key, it'll open up the Xbox Windows button. Likewise, Windows plus G does that, and if we press the keyboard button, it does that as well. So you have three buttons that do the same thing on SteamOS, which is non-ideal. The only way to bring out the quick access menu is by pressing the battery button. Here you can actually access all of the different types of functionality that a lot of people tend to like, and myself including in SteamOS, so that you can quickly go ahead and jump into different types of settings. Now the one thing to make note of here is that if you wanted to bring out the keyboard, likewise you're going to be doing the same thing. So if we go ahead and just launch Axiom Verge here, so now what you would want to do here is, if you wanted to bring up the keyboard, you would press the Windows button, and then this brings this out, and then you can once again press the battery icon. And then right here you would have the keyboard, and that's how you would bring up your keyboard. So it's multi-step to get to the keyboard. You could also change that setting as well when you are looking at general controls of global controls. And you can do that per game as well. So again, if we go ahead and lower this and we bring this out, you can actually go into your control settings, and then from here you can edit your layout. And then let's say that for the joysticks, the right click, you want to change that to a system button, okay? And you wanted that to be show the keyboard, right? So right click is now, R3 is now show keyboard. So if I press that in, the keyboard comes up. So those are things that you can do. Thankfully that SteamOS allows you to kind of do that. So you can kind of explore. For the most part, it's pretty straightforward and works just as well. You press the home button, you can easily exit a game. It's just a far more streamlined way to play PC games on the Win600 versus using Windows on the Win600. Overall, again, this is I'm kind of repeating myself here, but if you have a candy bar style device, using SteamOS is going to be far more streamlined. This right here is our total system power. It's not the package power. So our total system power is around 14 watt right now. We're going down. Let's see what this goes down to. All right, with a game like Axiom Verge, we seem to have capped out at around 12.5 watt total system power. That's basically it's effectively 3 hours of battery life that we have here. But again, it just runs just fine. Overall, I would say that if you wanted to do emulation, it gets really finicky, and especially because we don't have all of the available buttons that we do on the Steam Deck, it gets a little bit gnarly when we actually want to call up the quick access menu or just bring up the Steam menu, where because we're trying to flip between multiple windows that are open on an emulator, it gets not ideal. So for SteamOS, I would really say that the SteamOS build is more for playing PC-based games on SteamOS. If you wanted to do more emulation, it'd either be full-on Linux, which there might be some builds from some of the devs looking at this, or like Batocera, or if you were going to be looking at Windows, I would not really recommend running emulators on SteamOS version of Win600. We just don't have enough of the buttons available to us to actually make that worthwhile. I mean, that's pretty much it. To kind of recap, I wish that there were more buttons that we can actually make use of the quick access menu on SteamOS. I wish that there was Alt F4 or Control Alt Delete like there was to add extra buttons to have ejector seats for the Windows side of things. The mouse mode that X and Y and L2 and R2 did more. Those are little things that I think that would make it overall better. The analog sticks, their placement and how sensitive they are really like the weakest link here. The PWM screen is something that is not ideal for a lot of people. For me, I'm not bothered at all by PWM. You can actually see it a little bit, like if I bring in the screen. So you can see that the screen is flickering a little before my camera basically adjusts the frequency to match what the frequency that it's recording here, so it looks smooth for you. So this is a PWM type of display. A DC dimming would have been better. For me, it doesn't bother me as much, but I know some people don't like that. The last thing that I want to talk about, which is obviously on everyone's mind, and this is something that I kind of don't talk about because it's often subjective, and that's value, right? So on the 3050E model, the early bird pricing for this is $375 with no limit for it's just a time-based limit. But let's just say that this is a $400 unit. If we take a look at a 3050E laptop with similar types of specs with like 256 gigs of storage and 8 gigs of RAM, we're going to get close to $400. And remember, this includes shipping. The problem that the Win600 finds itself isn't that it's too expensive compared to other 3050E stuff. The problem is that a lot of people are going to compare this to the Steam Deck, especially the 64GB model. Compared to this is a drastic difference. The Steam Deck will handily outperform this in every regard, and you can get that at $400. Now, that is basically where this becomes a thing of where this competes with the Steam Deck. If we were to compare the size of this device to the Steam Deck, this is the only thing that I would say is the main takeaway between these devices. Yes, they are similar in price when this is the 64GB model Steam Deck versus the 3050E version of the Win600. However, if you are the type of person that believes that the Steam Deck is just too large, the Win600 is going to be a device where you can play indie games, some modern games at very low settings, but overall you're not going to get anywhere near where the Steam Deck is. The Steam Deck is, for all intents and purposes, at on average 6 times more powerful in performance, only from the factor of GPU. If we take a look at CPU, it's not as great of a difference because that's just how CPUs are. CPUs don't expand in power as much as GPUs do. But that is basically, like, if we were to just take a look at this, this is the main part that is the draw for the Win600. When you compare performance, the Steam Deck easily outperforms the Win600. However, it is a smaller candy bar shaped device. The performance isn't there. The price is comparative to other 3050E devices. If you were to look at this device as an emulation device, it really doesn't do enough of GameCube and enough of PS2 for me to be worthwhile from an emulation standpoint, at which point you go down to a previous generation which is better served to other Anbernic devices that are less expensive and smaller. Really, this device is for playing PC games, either on SteamOS or on Windows 10. And in that regard, it does play a lot of PC games without emulation, and it does it well within 12 to 18 watt. Just be mindful that you're going to get around 2 to 3 hours battery life on average. If you're playing a very low-end indie game like Stardew Valley, you'll get 4 hours there. But that's pretty much it. That has been my review of the Win600. Again, be careful with how you're going to overclock the RAM. What you want to target is your TDP. If you want to go less TDP, you're going to be better off doing better timings, less frequency. We don't care about feeding that GPU as much because we are still single channel and we're not going to get that dual channel bandwidth increase. We really have to focus on where you're going to get the benefits out of the CPU, and feeding the CPU faster is going to be better for us at lower TDPs versus trying to feed the GPU at higher TDPs. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, I'm going to have more videos on like tips and tricks on what you should want to do here. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.